The drone ascended in a sharp vertical line, its rotors slicing through the morning air with a steady, high-pitched hum. Ryan Mitchell stood in the center of the field, his gaze fixed on the monitor, while his thumbs danced over the controller sticks. He nudged the joystick, forcing the craft into a banking turn that brought the sprawling construction site into full view. From this height, the chaotic tangle of steel beams and dirt mounds snapped into a logical grid. He adjusted the gimbal, tilting the camera to lock onto a specific structural junction. He was not just recording footage, he was mapping the progress of every foundation layer. Back then, this was his sanctuary. He spent every weekend in these fields, treating the drone as an extension of his own reach. He knew the latency of every signal and the exact battery life remaining down to the second. He hovered the craft, letting it lock its position against the wind, watching the screen for the slightest flicker of data. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the live feed, searching for details that others would miss. He was entirely caught in the rhythm of the flight, completely unaware of the shift that was about to change the trajectory of his work. Ryan brought the drone down, the rotors slowing until the high-pitched whine faded into the rustle of dry grass. He unclipped the memory card and walked toward his truck. A vehicle pulled up to the gate, kicking up a cloud of dust. A man stepped out, holding a folder, and walked straight to Ryan. He had seen the drone hovering over the nearby housing development and needed shots for a property listing that had been sitting on the market for months. Ryan hesitated, then agreed to the task for a small fee. He returned the next day, flew the perimeter, and delivered the images. 2 weeks later, the agent called him again. The house had sold in record time. The agent credited the aerial perspective for the sudden influx of serious buyers. Ryan held the payment in his hand, looking at the check, then back at the drone resting in the trunk. The money was tangible, but the real impact was the speed of the result. He realized the drone was not just a toy for capturing landscapes, it was a tool for closing deals. He had provided a specific solution to a specific problem, and for the first time, he saw the path from a weekend hobby to a viable trade. Ryan spent the following weeks reviewing every job he had completed. He mapped out the requests, the construction manager who needed site volume estimates, the insurance adjuster who required roof damage reports, and the farmer checking crop health. Each client brought him a different set of obstacles. He looked at his flight logs and realized he had been thinking in reverse. He had been selling flight hours and high-resolution files, but his clients were paying for information. The drone was merely a sensor. The true product was the clarity he delivered. He stopped viewing his weekends as practice sessions and started treating them as research into industry inefficiencies. If a property sat on the market, the problem was visibility. If a construction site stalled, the problem was a lack of progress data. He began to strip away the unnecessary focus on hobbyist gear and started asking every prospective client the same question: what is preventing you from finishing this project today? He stopped pitching aerial imagery and started pitching time savings and risk reduction. The shift was absolute. He was no longer a hobbyist with a camera. He was a consultant using a specialized tool to solve complex logistical problems. He had found the core of his trade. Ryan realized that good intentions were not enough to survive in professional markets. He spent his evenings buried in aviation manuals and local regulatory codes. The hobbyist controller he had used for years felt light and fragile in his hands compared to the industrial-grade hardware he began researching. He signed up for a series of advanced flight certifications, trading his weekends for classroom hours and simulator testing. He learned to calibrate sensors for precision mapping and studied atmospheric physics to ensure stability in unpredictable conditions. Once certified, he sold his original gear and replaced it with heavy lift platforms and thermal imaging sensors capable of identifying structural heat loss. He spent weeks practicing flight patterns until he could maintain a consistent altitude within a centimeter of his target. He built a small workshop in his garage, installing charging stations and specialized data processing rigs. The room smelled of ozone and fresh plastic. Every piece of equipment was labeled, organized, and ready for deployment. He was no longer just flying. He was executing a technical protocol. When he finally walked out of the certification board office with his license in his pocket, he looked at his updated gear and knew he was ready to compete at the highest level of industry standards. The phone calls began as a trickle, then became a steady stream. A project manager for a massive infrastructure firm reached out, desperate to track earth-moving progress without halting heavy machinery. A large-scale commercial farmer contacted him, needing to identify water stress in a cornfield that spanned hundreds of acres. Ryan arrived at the construction site at dawn. He did not ask how long they wanted him in the air. He asked how many thousands of dollars they lost when a grade was off by just a few inches. He flew the site, processed the elevation data, and delivered a map that showed exactly where the drainage was failing. The manager finished the project 2 weeks ahead of schedule. At the farm, Ryan used thermal sensors to map irrigation leaks, saving the owner from a total harvest loss. He stopped charging by the hour and started charging by the value of the problem he solved. He moved from selling aerial photos to providing critical data-driven reports that allowed his clients to cut costs and avoid disasters. The feedback was immediate. His clients no longer cared about the drone, they cared about the efficiency he brought to their operations. His calendar filled up with contracts, not appointments. The massive infrastructure project covered 300 acres of rugged, uneven terrain. Ryan stood in the center of the field, his eyes darting between 3 different monitors. The drone was airborne for its 5th consecutive battery swap. He needed to map the entire site before the deadline, but the sheer volume of data was overwhelming his processor. He ran the landing sequence, swapped the battery, and launched again, his movements becoming mechanical. Then the server in his mobile unit began to overheat. A red warning light pulsed on the console, signaling a critical data lag. He had to decide: stop the flight to save the hardware, or risk a crash to finish the scan. The pressure was not just in the air. It was in the bottleneck of his own capacity. He could not be the pilot, the data analyst, and the field manager all at once. Every minute he spent in the field was an hour he did not have for analysis. He looked at the vast, unfinished topography through the lens, realizing that his own hands were no longer enough to contain the scope of his success. The system was reaching its limit, and he was the single point of failure. Ryan sold his single-unit mobile station and ordered 10 standardized flight kits. He began recruiting not just for flying ability, but for technical precision. He set up a training facility in a converted warehouse, running every candidate through simulations that mimicked the exact site conditions he had mastered. He taught them to look for the same drainage failures and structural inefficiencies he once hunted alone. Within 6 months, he had 3 teams operating in 3 different states. He moved his headquarters from a small desk to a central hub where live telemetry feeds arrived from across the region. The business was no longer tied to his own physical presence. He established protocols for data processing, ensuring that a project in the north matched the quality of a project in the south. He hired regional managers to oversee logistics, freeing his own schedule for high-level strategy. He was no longer flying drones. He was directing a network of sensors and analysts. The company grew from a local service provider into a regional powerhouse. Contracts arrived faster than his teams could deploy. He had successfully decoupled his income from his own hands, turning a solo pursuit into a scalable, high-volume operation. The sun was low over the park when Ryan spotted a young man struggling to calibrate a drone. The aircraft hovered erratically, fighting against a light breeze. Ryan walked over, watching the enthusiast adjust the throttle with tense, jerky movements. The young man looked up, recognizing him, and immediately asked about the best flight settings for capturing long-range footage. Ryan did not take the controller. He watched the drone stabilize for a moment before turning his attention back to the pilot. The enthusiast was focused entirely on the machine, treating the flight as the objective. Ryan stepped closer, pointing toward the construction site visible in the distance. He watched the young man look out at the horizon, waiting for a technical answer that never came. Instead, Ryan spoke clearly. "You are spending all your energy on the flight. The drone is not the business. The problem you solve is the business." The young man paused, his thumb hovering over the joystick. The drone drifted slightly, but he did not correct it immediately. He looked from the machine to the horizon, absorbing the shift in perspective. Ryan stood still, watching the realization take hold, knowing he had passed on the only lesson that truly mattered. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of server cooling fans. Ryan closed the heavy door and walked toward the desk. He sat down, the leather chair creaking as he settled in. He tapped the keyboard, waking the primary monitor. A series of windows flickered to life, displaying live project status reports from across the country. He navigated to the annual financial summary. The cursor blinked, waiting for the final quarterly integration to process. He clicked the Finalize button. The progress bar crawled forward, stalling at 99%. Ryan watched the screen, his hands resting motionless on the desk surface. He waited through the system's hesitation. The bar snapped to full. The screen refreshed, pulling in the final data points from the regional accounts. The total revenue figure scrolled rapidly, digits blurring before settling into a steady, static display. The commas clicked into place. 1 million. Exactly. The number stood stark and clear against the dark background. He tapped his finger once against the desk, the sound sharp in the empty room. The objective that had once seemed impossible was now a documented reality, verified by the cold, hard precision of the math on his screen. Ryan leaned back, the chair springs yielding under his weight. The million-dollar figure remained on the monitor, a static monument to years of labor. He looked past the screen, his gaze catching the blurred movement of city lights outside the window. His mind drifted back to a dusty residential street, the day of his first real estate contract. He remembered the weight of the envelope in his hand, the small fee that felt more significant than any contract he signed today. Back then, he had been uncertain if the drone could ever be more than a weekend distraction. He traced the path from that single sale to the team he led now. Every decision had been anchored to a simple requirement: solve the client's problem. He had never chased the hype or the newest hardware for the sake of novelty. He had focused on the utility of the data, the precision of the results, and the reliability of the insights. The millions were a byproduct, not the goal. He sat in the silence of the office, the air conditioning cycling on with a soft click. There was no rush to leave, no drive to start the next project immediately. He simply sat, acknowledging the distance covered and the clarity of the path that led him here. The cycle was complete.